The discussion was sparked by the fact that one of my husband's young nephews' new wife was covered from head to toe, including the face. The family was angry with this extremism, and someone had suggested to look up what the Quran has to say on the topic. Subsequently, I was watching a living room full of people engaged in heated discussions. I could not understand things, but knew that people were of differing opinion on this. What struck me most was how everybody, men, women, young and old, were very much engaged in the discussion. This was in the early 80s. Back then, I was in the midst of my graduate studies studying women's issues and feminist theory. I was truly rooting for the women, not even knowing what they were arguing. But they didn't really need my support, as their voices were loud and opinionated, I could tell. I was struck by the whole thing, and a window opened in my mind then. I learned that I and probably many of my fellow feminists had a distorted view of the complexities of this culture and the women who live in it. Just as many of us here in the West have a distorted view of the religion of Islam in general. This visit and others to Egypt was an eye-opener for me. And for the first time, I understood how my late husband could have evolved from this culture to what I often teased him to be, a Muslim Unitarian in search of the truth. Mahmoud Hassan Fouad called himself a Muslim, and he was proud of his religion. He did not pray 5 times a day, and he occasionally had a glass of wine. Did that make him a bad Muslim? Some certainly believed so. But for him, Islam was the relationship between the individual and God, guided by the book and not any prescribed rules imposed from elsewhere. And he strongly felt that his salvation was between him and God. In his memory, and because I see so many misconceptions about Islam, and because of today's anti-Islamic climate, I have decided to give this sermon. I'm not a scholar of Islam. I don't practice it. My sole qualification is that I lived with a moderate Muslim for 19 years and visited with him family in Egypt and lived with him for 1 year in Damascus, Syria. What I want to tell you is how these experiences have shaped my view of Islam and the Islamic culture, which has been substantiated in some recent literature that attempts to counter the growing anti-Islamic movement in the West and the radicalism in the Islamic world itself. I brought some of the literature that I have read to prepare for this too, and if you're interested, you can look at them afterwards. In his book, Moving the Mountain, Imam Said Abdul Rauf calls himself, by the way, Imam Abdul Rauf is the imam who became famous with the center in Lower Manhattan that was opening. Okay. He calls himself an Orthodox Muslim, neither an Islamist nor a radical jihadist. By Orthodox, he says, I mean the authentic mainstream, moderate, nonviolent religion practiced by the vast majority of Muslims since the day of the Prophet. He continues, Orthodox Islam is a powerful, deep, beautiful, ancient and modern, wisdom-based, justice-seeking religion. The Muslim people I have interacted with and known are part of this majority. While we are bombarded with media images of jihadists and Islamists shouting God is great and death to America and attacking our embassies abroad, it is easy to forget the mainstream Muslims who are spread all over the world. The Middle East may be the place where Islam originated, but But in terms of numbers, Muslims in the rest of the world outnumber those living in the Middle East. In fact, India and Bangladesh alone outnumber the Middle East in sheer numbers of Muslims. And of the 8 countries in the world with most Muslims, 7 are not even Arab-speaking countries. Think of all the places in the world that aren't dominating the headlines: Malaysia, Turkey, Nigeria, and others. The majority of the 1.5 billion Muslims are ordinary people going about their daily lives, not seen demonstrating on television screens. Among this silent majority are women and men who are advancing the cause against Islamist oppression and fighting to outlaw ancient customs. Those efforts do not get as much airtime in the West, unfortunately. We here in the West, one of the most common misconceptions about Islams we have here in the West, which has bugged me for a long time, is how we use and fear the word Allah. How many of you have seen people cringe when they hear the word Allah? What is your reaction when you hear the word? Did you know that Allah is just the Arabic word for God? Most Americans don't have a problem with the words Dios or Dieu or God. If you watch a Spanish language movie and a character says Dios, the English subtitle says God. Yet if you watch an Arabic language movie and you see an Arab interview on CNN, Allah is never translated in subtitles, despite the fact that it is no different from the other words. Open the Bible in Arabic and you will see the word Allah. Time and again, the word Allah is not translated into English when everything around it is. Think of the effect that this has on our subconscious of people on the subconscious of people in the West. Is it really surprising that somehow Allah invokes this fearful, mysterious image of a foreign power that is in competition with our Christian God? Again, Allah simply means God in Arabic. Christians, Jews, and Muslims seem to have forgotten that all 3 traditions have the same roots and the same God. Actually, it sometimes seems to me that Christians and Jews are much more guilty of this than Muslims. In my experience from living in the Middle East, I have found Muslims to be far more knowledgeable about Abraham, Noah, Moses, and Jesus, and which is actually Isa in Arabic. Jesus is Isa in Arabic. And all the other prophets than a lot of people I meet in the West. They know more than I do often about the Bible and the history, Judeo-Christian history. Jesus is mentioned numerous times in the Quran. He is regarded as one of the prophets, like Abraham before him and Muhammad after him. It is said in the Quran that the day of judgment will be marked by the return of Jesus to earth, not Muhammad. While I was a member of the Unitarian Church in Pocatello, Idaho, where I used to live, my late husband would always come to the Festival of Lights service and read the portion of Christ's birth out of the Quran. The passage is too long to read here, but I want to read just a part of it for you. In Surah 19, 16 through 34, when Mary is approached by an angel announcing she will bear a special child named Jesus, her response is, and I quote from the Quran, "O my Lord, how shall I have a son when no man hath touches me?" And later we learn, so she conceived him, and the pains of childbirth drove her to the trunk of a palm tree. She cried in her anguish, "Ah, would I that I had died before this, would that I had been a thing forgotten of and out of sight. But a voice cried to her from beneath the palm tree, "Grieve not, for thy Lord hath provided a rivulet beneath thee, and shake towards thyself the trunk of the palm tree. It will let fall fresh ripe dates upon thee. So eat and drink and cool thine eye. And if thou dost see any man, say, I have vowed a fast to God, God most gracious, and this day I will enter into no talk with any human being." At length, Mary brought the babe to her people, carrying him in her arms. They said, "O Mary, truly an amazing thing hast thou brought to us." Unquote. In the Quran story, Mary does not meet Joseph in that story. After all, it's been an immaculate birth. I always cherished that part in my early feminist days. But more about women later. When I used to visit Egypt with my husband and my son Amir, I was more aware of various customs foreign to me rather than the prevalence of religion in daily life. For example, the first time I went there, after getting married in 1981, I had to witness the slaughter of a lamb in honor of my marriage, which, by the way, I didn't like. It made me sick. And neighbors came by and brought gifts, among them 2 geese and some juice I was not allowed to drink because I probably would get sicker from it. The only obvious sign of the prevalence of religion was the call to prayer, which I did not find annoying, except maybe at dawn, since the minarets were often very close to where I slept. But I accepted the sound of the call of prayer as an integral part of my cultural experience in Egypt and in Damascus. Let's face it, I had heard many loud bells of Christian churches during my childhood growing up in Europe. Both are actually pleasant sounds for me. Incidentally, I read while preparing for the sermon that the minarets were adaptation from the early Christian church towers in the time of the prophet. I wish I had had that bit of information when my Swiss brother-in-law voted for the minaret ban in Switzerland, arguing with me that they were phallic representation of the Muslim power trying to take over Switzerland. But back to the village, this Sneet, where my former husband, late husband, was born. Most of my husband's family are practicing Muslims, but I never felt that their prayers were interfering daily life. It was not that everybody dropped everything at once and dropped down to the floor to pray. No, praying was done individually and discreetly in a separate room. Unlike in our culture, where I have to participate sometimes in Christian prayers before dinner, I was never in that situation where I had to do something like that in the Middle East. I did take part in a ritual performed only by women, where we attempted to drive out the evil spirit in the house because there was a newborn in the house. We formed a line with the mother and child in front and queued through the entire apartment, making sure that everyone in line crossed over the burning incense in the living room 7 times. This is not in the Quran, but rather an ancient tradition. And I personally found it fascinating to be part of this women's ritual. It was a great experience. The first commandment of Islam is to bear witness to the oneness of God and bear witness that Muhammad is God's messenger. The first part in Arabic is La ilaha illa Allah. will often see La ilaha illallah, which, by the way, is the emblem on our service on the front. You will often see that put up in front of houses or in living rooms in beautiful calligraphy. And I've seen really beautiful things. Also, Muslims often use that phrase just as we say, good God or God Almighty. I remember also my former mother-in-law sitting in the village outside Cairo, counting the prayer beads, reciting this phrase. It was actually not foreign to me, as I had seen many Italian ladies doing a similar thing with the prayer beads when I would visit Italy during my childhood every summer. While I personally cannot relate to the bead ritual itself, I can comprehend what Imam Raoul says in Moving the Mountain about the statement, La ilaha illallah. He says, by making this statement, we, meaning Muslims, are being witness to God's oneness, God's power, and God's revelation to the prophet and the prophets before him. But the emphasis is both on God and the individual. As the Quran also states, remember me, so I will remember you. Imam Raouf explains, quote, it is a covenantal act and active commitment between the individual and God, rather than an article of passive faith. I think I can relate to, because I feel the same way about our 7 principles. Another thing I think I can relate to is the Muslim concept of God. God as the omnipresent force resisting definition, unlike in the Christian tradition where we seem to have humanized God and Jesus. I'm reminded here of the definition, or should I say undefinition of God, which Christiana suggested in her sermon this summer, entitled, Is God a White Racist? Maybe some of you heard it. If not, I suggest you go read it. The language of the Quran is highly poetic and lends itself to chanting and melodic readings. You can hear that in the call of prayer. And I heard it sometimes on the radio when I happened to be in a taxi in Cairo or in Damascus. The repeating of the phrase La ilaha illallah can be compared to the Buddhist meditative practice of mantra, for example. So all Muslims must learn enough Arabic to be able to read the Quran, mostly so it would not lose its poetic and melodic aspect when read aloud. Until fairly recently, there have not been many translations of the Quran. For this reason, but also for another reason, for its importance as the foundation of Islamic law. Which brings me to another explosively charged term, Sharia law. As so many Americans, I too sometimes think of beheadings, cutting off the hands, or women being stoned when I hear Sharia law. However, after reading both Aslan's book and Imam Raouf's book, I have come to understand that Sharia law is not a simple barbaric way to deal with society, but a legal system that has grown over the last 14 centuries and includes court rulings by early caliphs and later by judges and writings of many legal scholars, which then eventually evolved into the Islamic jurisprudence called fiqh al-sharia. Sort of maybe like what we refer to the constitutional law in our legal system, that kind of body of legal opinions. Of course, we have a hard time with the fact that Sharia is rooted in the religious text. But although I don't know much about this, apparently so is Jewish law. Sharia consists of roughly 150 to 500 Quranic verses that prescribe or prohibit behavior, including inheritance and status of women. But it is not a legal text, per se. It does not regulate external behavior of the community in any way, as I read the Torah does in Judaism, but again, I don't know enough about it. For regulating external behavior, the Islamic legal system turns to the hadith of the Prophet, which are statements that were attributed to the Prophet after his death. And they are known under the term of sunnah. And that's where it gets interesting and confusing. Over the first 2 decades after the Prophet's death, these hadith became so convoluted that according to Aslan, by the 9th century, some legal scholars attempted to catalog the authentic hadiths from the made-up ones. Since then, Islamic scholars have issued various legal opinions called fatwas, where there was no clear answer from the Quran or a hadith. These scholars are referred to as the ulama, and for centuries they have held a monopoly on the interpretation of the Quran and the hadith and have made sure that the book could not be translated, the Quran. Reza Aslan in his book contends that this has had a great impact on the lack of Islamic reform, and especially hurt women, who historically have been further removed from the text than men. However, in the last decade, numerous translations of the Quran have appeared, and Islam is undergoing a sort of a reformation. People are turning to the book themselves and interpreting the text now that it's available in different languages, not just Arabic. In fact, televangelists have sprung up in the Arabic world. For example, Amr Khaled, an Egyptian, for lack of a better term, mainstream evangelist, if you will, who is very famous. He has a weekly show on TV across the Muslim world where he actually dispenses advice on religious and legal matters. And that's not jihadist kind of talk. I mean, this is people go there as people would go maybe to listen to Billy Graham in our tradition, that kind of thing. I never heard of him until I read about this recently. But 2 million, he has 2 million followers on Facebook. And he has made Time magazine, who have voted him one of the 13th most influential figure in 2007, I think it was. So he is famous in the Arab world. In addition, let's see, the young people of mainstream Islam, male and female, are now also going online for their spiritual questions on how to reconcile their modern lives with their faith. You have so-called cyber muftis who give religious advice. In addition, young people in Islamic countries now often visit one of many of Islamic online competitors. FatwaOnline.com, Islamoscope.net, IslamQAs.com, for example. That's the young generation. But you guessed it. The fanatics are also using the internet. But rather than focusing on that minority, I want to focus on the women who have and are gaining from what Islam calls the Islamic Reformation, because it has allowed them access to religious, political, and social and ethical discussions outside the living room. Women in the Middle East may have a long way to go, but they have the Prophet's teaching of egalitarianism before God on their side, and I have faith in them. Which brings me back to the discussion in the living room. There is no line in the Quran that requires women to wear the veil. When the word hijab, which has been translated as the veil, is mentioned in the Quran, it is always in relation to Muhammad's wives. As a matter of fact, as some women authors have pointed out, the term for donning the veil, darab al-hijab, was used simultaneously with becoming Muhammad's wife. Another passage that often is quoted is that women should quote, draw clothes around them so as to be recognized as believers when visiting the Prophet's wives. Or in another part, instructing women to, quote, guard their private parts and throw scarves over their bosoms. Nothing is said about covering the face anywhere in the Quran. The Quran addresses modesty for men and women, emphasizing equality of the sexes before God. God, it says in the Quran, Surah 30:35, God offers forgiveness and great reward for men who speak the truth and women who speak the truth, for men who are humble and women who are humble, for men who are modest and women who are modest. So, women's clothing and veiling varies greatly among Muslim women. Very few actually cover their entire face. The majority only wear the hijab, the head cover. I've noticed myself over the years that more women now opt for covering their hair. If you ask the younger generation of women, they often tell you that it is their choice to wear their hijab. And these are highly educated women, doctors, lawyers, and educators. I have heard them argue that they want to wear it as it gives them a sort of liberty from the quote unquote male world. Muslim girls now make fashion statements with their hijab. They're very colorful, and oftentimes they wear them with Western clothing, like jeans, for example. In Iran, women started to wear the hijab back in the 70s to oppose the Shah. But now, and I've seen that on TV, they often wear loose scarves around their heads to protest the current regime. So oftentimes women's dress is also a political statement. As early as 1923, the first Egyptian feminist, Hoda Sharawi, threw a veil into the river as a symbolic gesture to protest the lack of women's rights in Egypt, 1923. How many of you knew that there has been an active women's movement, at least in Egypt, since that time? Sharawi formed the Egyptian Feminist Union and attended the feminist conference in Rome in 1923. She gave lectures against polygamy and other social issues. Since then, other women have followed her in her footsteps. In the 50s and 60s, Nawal el-Saadawi made a name for herself fighting for women's rights during the nationalist labor movement when Nasser came to power in the 50s. And by the way, she actually lived over here, she was exiled at one point and came to America and gave lectures and taught at Stanford, I want to say, maybe not. So let's not forget that many Islamic countries have had women head of states. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Turkey, Indonesia, Senegal, for example. In Turkey, women earned the full voting rights in 1934. I can't say that of Switzerland, for example. Here in America, Islamic women demand to be in mosques on Friday and to become imams to lead prayers in the mosques. In 2006, Daisy, Imam Raouf's wife, started the WISE project, which is the first female shura council, of just female shura council, which is involved in shaping Islamic law. That council is actively working with NGOs around the world to promote women's rights and abolish old customs damaging women's health in the Islamic world. There are numerous other examples of Islamic female activism at work. I'd like to finish with a little anecdote from Nawal al-Saadawi's memoirs, which I have up here. This is her description of an exchange of two men on a committee in the 50s interviewing her for a post as a village doctor for their town. Nawal was one of the first female doctors at the time when the nationalistic government of Nasser implemented clinics in towns across Egypt. And I'm quoting from her memoir. One of the men says, Dr. Nawal, we know you're excellent in your work, but to work in a rural area is not an easy thing for one who belongs to the fair sex. I would like to ask you, Dr. Nawal, supposing you're called upon in the middle of the night for an urgent case, can you venture out in the dark? Wouldn't you be afraid that the wolves might attack you as you walk through fields? If your high heels get stuck in the mud or in a heap of manure, what will you do? Nawal doesn't offer her response, but she simply writes, that day, as usual, I was wearing my flat, thick-soled shoes, and they were covered with the dust they had picked up as I had walked from our home in Giza down to where that meeting was being held. While many Muslim women are now active participants in the workforce, often as doctors, engineers, and chemists, this male chauvinism is still deeply embedded in the Muslim culture. So when I'm visiting my family in Egypt, I hear the man calling their wives or daughters, get me a glass of water, bring me this, bring me that, while they sit in a chair in the living room. But I happen to know that in many cases in the Fouad family, the wife is very much consulted for important decisions and often even considered what we would refer to as the boss in the house. But publicly, no Arab male is ready to admit that yet. I have faith that in due time, this may change too. Inshallah, God willing, as Muslims would say.